Every lord in Valadorn knew the name before they knew the danger. Duke Caedric Vexley, ruler of the Iron Marches. The man who built an empire on the bones of everyone who underestimated him. They whispered about his cruelty in corridors where candlelight barely reached. They debated his genius in war rooms they would never be invited to enter. But none of them, not one, ever spoke about the woman he destroyed to get there. That silence is where this story lives. And if you stay until the silence breaks, you will understand why the most powerful man in the kingdom is also the most dangerous thing a man can be. Afraid. The feast hall of Blackthorn Keep could seat 300. Tonight it held 47, and each of them wished they were somewhere else. Caedric Vexley stood at the head of the obsidian table with a goblet he had not touched. The wine inside was Ethermere Red, a vintage that cost more per cask than a common soldier earned in a year. He held it the way other men held weapons. Not to drink. To remind everyone watching that he could afford to waste what they could not afford to taste. The candelabras threw jagged light across his face. 41 years had carved him into something that resembled less a nobleman and more a geological event. The jaw was blunt iron. The eyes sat deep beneath a brow that seemed designed to cast permanent shadow over whatever softness might once have lived there. His dark hair was pulled back from a widow's peak that had begun silvering at the temples, not from age, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping every night in a fortress full of people who wanted you dead. He had not spoken for 11 minutes. The lords seated along the table exchanged glances. Lord Harstan Drell, whose tin mine supplied a quarter of the kingdom's armor plating, cleared his throat twice before managing words. Your Grace, the border levy question remains unresolved. The Northern Marches petitioned 6 weeks ago, Caedric said without looking at him. His voice carried the texture of gravel dragged across slate. I declined 6 weeks ago. You are repeating a dead man's request, Harstan. Choose your next sentence carefully, because I am genuinely curious whether you understand the difference between persistence and stupidity. Silence dropped like a blade. Drell's mouth opened, closed. He reached for his own goblet and drank deep enough to excuse not speaking. At the far end of the table, Lord Aldous Fenwick, 63, survivor of 2 civil conflicts and 3 assassination attempts, studied Caedric with the careful attention of a man watching a predator decide whether it was hungry. Fenwick had served Caedric's father. He remembered a boy who laughed. That boy was dead now, replaced by this monument to calculated hostility, and Fenwick had long since stopped mourning the transformation. You did not mourn volcanoes for ceasing to be mountains. The Treasury report, Fenwick said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. You asked for it before the week turned. Caedric's gaze shifted. Where it landed on Drell like a boot, it settled on Fenwick like a hand testing the weight of a familiar blade. I did. The numbers are troubling, Your Grace. Numbers are never troubling, Aldous. The men who produce them are troubling. The numbers simply confirm what I already suspect. Caedric set the untouched goblet down with a precision that made 2 nearby lords flinch. Someone is feeding from my accounts like a pig at a trough, and they believe I am too distracted by expansion to notice. He let the sentence hang. 46 people in that hall held their breath while Caedric Vexley's gaze traveled the length of the table like a slow fire consuming a fuse. He was searching. Not for guilt. Guilt was useless to him. He was searching for the specific quality of fear that only appeared in a man who knew exactly what he had done. He found it in 3 faces simultaneously and filed each one away for later destruction. Enjoy the wine, he said. It's the last generous thing this table will offer any of you for quite some time. He turned and walked out through the iron-banded doors without waiting for anyone to stand. The feast continued in his absence the way a heartbeat continues after a near drowning, mechanically, desperately, without any real belief that the danger had passed. The private corridor leading to Caedric's chambers ran along the eastern cliff face of Blackthorn Keep. Wind howled through arrow slits cut into stone walls 3 feet thick. The fortress had been built by his grandfather, a man who believed that architecture should communicate a single message to anyone approaching: turn back. Caedric walked with the measured stride of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was a vulnerability. His boots struck the flagstone in a rhythm that echoed off walls lined with campaign banners. 14 conquests, each one represented by the torn standard of a defeated house. He did not look at them. Trophies were for men who needed reminding of what they had accomplished. Caedric needed no reminding. Every victory lived in his body like a scar that ached before storms. He entered his chambers and stopped. She was already there. Seraphina sat in the window alcove with her knees drawn up and a book open across her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching the storm build over the iron marches, a wall of black cloud rolling in from the coast like an army assembling for siege. The candlelight caught her profile and held it in amber. Dark auburn hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders. Her face carried the kind of beauty that did not announce itself but simply existed, the way a blade existed, purposeful, unadorned, dangerous in the right light. She did not look up when he entered. This was not defiance. This was intimacy. 12 years of marriage had taught her that Caedric entered rooms the way weather entered landscapes. You did not greet it. You simply adapted to its presence and waited to see whether it would nourish or destroy. "You frightened Drell again," she said. "Drell frightens himself. I simply provide the occasion. He controls 20% of our armor supply chain. He controls 20% of an armor supply chain that I built. The distinction matters." Caedric pulled the leather cord from his hair and let it fall past his jaw. The gesture stripped years from him. In this light, in this room, with this woman, the Duke of the Iron Marches looked almost human. Fenwick flagged the treasury discrepancies. Seraphina closed the book. "How bad?" "Systematic. Whoever is siphoning the accounts knows our reporting cycles. They time withdrawals to fall between audit windows. Inside knowledge. Inside someone who sits at my table and eats my food and plots my financial dismemberment between courses." He dropped into the chair across from her. The leather groaned beneath his weight. "I built this from nothing, Seraphina. From a name people laughed at, and a keep that was falling into the sea. Every stone and every wall of every holding I control was purchased with something I cannot get back. And someone believes they can simply reach into my treasury and take what they want because they assume the Duke is too busy conquering to count his own gold." She studied him. Not with admiration. That had evolved years ago into something more complex and less comfortable. She studied him the way a physician studies a patient whose symptoms they recognize but whose prognosis they dread. "You're not angry about the money," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "No. You are angry because someone close to you thinks you are weak enough to rob." He said nothing, which in their private language meant she was exactly right, and he hated her precision the way a wounded animal hates the hand that finds the thorn. Seraphina rose from the alcove and crossed to him. She placed one hand on his shoulder. The gesture was not tender. Tenderness had never been their currency. It was grounding, a physical reminder that he existed in a context larger than his own rage. "Find them," she said, "but find them intelligently, not the way you found Lord Cresswell." Cresswell deserved what he received. Cresswell deserved a trial. What he received was a spectacle that cost us 2 trade alliances and a marriage pact with House Ashworth. The Ashworths were never going to honor that pact. We will never know, will we? Because you mounted Cresswell's accounting ledgers on a pike outside the merchant gate before the ink on the investigation was dry. Her voice carried no judgment. It carried something worse, the exhausted patience of someone who had been right too many times to find satisfaction in it. "You have a gift for destruction, Caedric. It is your gift for patience that concerns me." He looked up at her. In the candlelight, something moved behind his eyes that he would never permit another living soul to see. Not vulnerability. He had cauterized that years ago. Something closer to recognition. The awareness that this woman understood the machinery of his mind better than he did, and that this understanding was simultaneously the most valuable and the most terrifying thing in his life. "Stay," he said. It was not a request. Caedric Vexley did not make requests. But Seraphina had learned to hear the architecture beneath his commands, the load-bearing walls of need that held up the edifice of authority. Stay meant I am not finished becoming whatever I am becoming, and you are the only mirror that shows me the truth. She stayed. The next 3 months passed like a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. Caedric's expansion campaign consumed the western territories with methodical precision. 3 lesser lords surrendered their holdings without battle, a testament not to Caedric's mercy, but to the mathematical certainty of his military superiority. 2 others resisted and were dismantled so thoroughly that their family names were struck from provincial records within a generation. Blackthorn Keep swelled with new wealth, tapestries from conquered estates, weapons forged in captured foundries, gold enough to line the treasury vaults 3 deep. And with the gold came the visitors. They arrived in silk and ambition, noble families angling for proximity to the most powerful duke in the kingdom. They brought daughters and sons and proposals wrapped in flattery, so thick it could be sliced and served at banquet. Caedric entertained them with the cold efficiency of a man who understood that politics was simply warfare conducted with dinner invitations instead of cavalry charges. It was during the Harvest Assembly, an annual gathering of the kingdom's 12 most powerful houses, that Lady Isolde Ravenshire entered Blackthorn Keep for the first time. She arrived without announcement. No herald, no entourage beyond a single handmaid and a personal guard whose armor bore the Ravenshire crest, a silver raven clutching a crown in its talons. The crest alone communicated everything her entrance did not. The Ravenshire family had held seats on the royal council for 4 consecutive generations. They did not need trumpets. Their bloodline was the trumpet. Isolde herself was a composition in deliberate contrasts. Pale skin against black velvet, silver blonde hair arranged with a carelessness that had clearly required hours to achieve. Her eyes, a shade of gray that shifted between smoke and steel depending on the light, moved across the great hall of Blackthorn Keep with the unhurried assessment of someone appraising property they intended to acquire. She found Caedric immediately, not because he was the largest presence in the room, though he was, not because the other lords unconsciously oriented themselves around him like planets caught in gravitational pull, though they did. She found him because she had been studying him for 2 years from a distance, and she recognized the specific quality of isolation that surrounded him even in a crowded hall. It was the isolation of a man who had outgrown every relationship in his life except one, and that one Isolde had already identified as the structural weakness she intended to exploit. "Your Grace," she offered a curtsy calibrated to communicate respect without subservience. "Lady Isolde Ravenshire, I believe our families have never been formally introduced, which strikes me as an oversight neither of us should tolerate." Caedric regarded her with the flat appraisal he applied to all newcomers, the rapid calculation of threat, utility, and expendability that functioned as his social instinct. "The Ravenshires have never required introduction," he said. "Your family's influence precedes you the way smoke precedes fire. Whether that is a compliment depends entirely on what you intend to burn." Isolde smiled. It was a precise instrument, that smile. It communicated amusement and intelligence and absolutely nothing about what she was actually thinking. "I intend to burn nothing, Your Grace. I am merely here to observe. The Iron Marches have accomplished in a decade what most duchies fail to achieve in a century. I find ambition on this scale instructive." Instructive. He repeated the word as though testing its weight. "Most people call it dangerous." "Most people are not Ravenshires." From across the hall, Seraphina watched the exchange with the particular stillness of someone who has just heard a sound they cannot yet identify, but know instinctively to be wrong. She had survived 12 years as the wife of the most feared man in Valadorn, not through beauty or political cunning, though she possessed both, but through an almost preternatural ability to read the atmospheric pressure of a room. And the pressure had just changed, the way it changes before earthquakes, before avalanches, before the kind of catastrophe that reshapes landscapes and buries everything that was built upon them. She watched Isolde Ravenshire's hand brush Caedric's forearm during conversation, a touch so brief and precisely placed that it could have been accidental. It was not accidental. Seraphina recognized the gesture because she understood the vocabulary of calculated physical contact the way a linguist understands grammar. That touch was a sentence. Its meaning was, "I know where your armor has gaps." Seraphina said nothing. She filed the observation in the same mental vault where she stored every threat she had ever catalogued during her years at Blackthorn Keep. The vault was getting crowded. Over the following weeks, Isolde Ravenshire became a fixture at court. Her presence operated like a slow poison, invisible in individual doses, devastating in accumulation. She appeared at council sessions where military contracts were discussed, offering insights that demonstrated an understanding of supply logistics that no ornamental noblewoman should possess. She hosted private dinners with the Duke's senior commanders, conversations that lasted hours and produced no minutes, no records, no witnesses. And she began spending time with Caedric, not in the overt, scandalous manner of a typical court seductress. Isolde was far too intelligent for that. She positioned herself as a strategic asset, a woman whose family connections to the royal council could open doors that Caedric's military power alone could not breach. She spoke to him about succession politics, about the aging king's failing health, about the fractures within the royal house that a sufficiently ambitious duke might exploit. She spoke to him about the throne, not directly. Isolde never said anything directly. She painted pictures with implication, constructed architectures of possibility, using nothing but carefully placed questions and strategically timed silences. She asked him what he believed the kingdom needed. She asked him what legacy meant to a man who had already conquered everything within his reach. She asked him whether he had ever wondered what it would feel like to kneel before no one. Caedric listened. That was the part Seraphina noticed first, not the conversations themselves, those she could have countered. What she noticed was that Caedric was listening to another voice with the focused intensity he had previously reserved exclusively for her. It was not jealousy she felt. Jealousy was a common woman's affliction, and Seraphina Valhart was constitutionally incapable of anything common. What she felt was the cold recognition of a structural shift. The foundation of her marriage was not love. She had never been naive enough to build on that ground. The foundation was relevance. She was the person Caedric needed most because she was the person who understood him best. Isolde Ravenshire was constructing a competing argument. The confrontation came on a night when rain hammered Blackthorn Keep like a besieging army testing the walls for weakness. Seraphina found Caedric in his study, a room lined with maps and campaign records, and the particular silence that accumulated around a man reviewing plans he did not intend to share with his wife. An open letter bearing the Ravenshire seal sat on the desk between them like a declaration of war. "When were you going to tell me?" Seraphina asked. Caedric did not look up. "Tell you what? That the Ravenshires have offered you a path to the royal council seat. That the price of that seat is a marriage alliance. That Isolde has been negotiating terms for weeks while I hosted her at my table and served her wine from my cellar and pretended I did not notice the way she looks at you like you are a territory she has already mapped." He raised his eyes. In them she saw something that frightened her more than anger, more than cruelty, more than any of the calculated brutalities she had witnessed over 12 years of marriage. She saw ambition that had outgrown its container. "The throne, Seraphina." "I heard you. Not a council seat. The throne. The Ravenshires have the bloodline proximity, the political infrastructure, and the votes within the Royal Assembly. What they lack is military power. What I lack is legitimate proximity to the succession." He stood, and in that movement she saw the geometry of a decision already made. Together you and Isolde dismantle everything we built and replace it with a gamble dressed in silk and ambition. Seraphina's voice did not rise. It dropped. It became something low and dense and heavy with the weight of 12 years of truths she had held back because the timing was never right. "I stood beside you when you were nothing, when this keep was crumbling and the treasury was empty, and every lord in the marches was betting on your failure. I stood beside you and I did not flinch, and you are going to look me in the eye and tell me that what Isolde Ravenshire offers is worth more than that. She offers a kingdom. I offered you a life." The silence between them filled the room like floodwaters, rising, cold, impossible to stand in. Caedric turned toward the window. The storm outside had intensified. Lightning fractured the sky above the iron marches, illuminating for one frozen instant the vast empire of stone and steel and subjugated territory that stretched from the cliffs to the horizon. "I have made my decision," he said. 4 words. 12 years of marriage, of partnership, of shared blood and shared beds and shared survival. compressed into 4 words delivered to a window, because the man who feared nothing in Valadorn could not say them to her face. Seraphina stood motionless for 7 seconds. She counted them, each one a funeral for something she had believed was indestructible. Then she turned and walked out of the room. She did not slam the door. That was worse. The divorce was announced before the full court 3 days later. Caedric stood on the iron dais in full ceremonial armor, black plate etched with the Vexley crest, and dissolved his marriage to Seraphina Valhart with the same efficient brutality he applied to military campaigns. No explanation was offered beyond irreconcilable divergence of dynastic objectives. The phrase landed like a blade wrapped in parchment. Seraphina stood at the back of the hall in a traveling cloak, her possessions already loaded onto a single cart waiting in the courtyard. She did not weep. She did not protest. She watched Caedric speak with an expression that 300 assembled nobles would later describe as cold fury, but that Caedric himself, in the 3 seconds he allowed himself to look at her, recognized as something far more devastating. Grief. Not for him. For the version of him she had believed existed somewhere beneath the armor and the ambition and the architecture of control. Grief for a man who had never actually been real. She left Blackthorn Keep at dawn. The gates closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. Lord Fenwick stood on the eastern battlement and watched her cart descend the cliff road until it disappeared into the morning fog. He was the only person in the keep who watched her go. He turned to find Caedric standing behind him. "She's gone," Fenwick said. "I know. She will not come back. I know." Fenwick studied the Duke's face for some trace of the boy he had once known. The boy who had loved fiercely and trusted completely and believed that strength and tenderness could coexist in the same body. He found nothing. The geological event had completed its formation. Whatever had been human in Caedric Vexley had been buried beneath layers of strategic calculus so thick that even grief could not reach the surface. "You have made a mistake, Your Grace," Fenwick said. "The kind that does not announce itself immediately. The kind that waits. And when it finally arrives, it brings everything with it." Caedric said nothing. He watched the empty road where Seraphina's cart had vanished, and inside the vast and terrible machinery of his mind, something shifted. A gear slipping, a mechanism faltering, a sound so small and so deep that he would not recognize it for what it was until years later when the entire apparatus began to collapse. The sound of a man who had just destroyed the only thing he could not rebuild. 6 weeks later, the marriage to Isolde Ravenshire was celebrated with a ceremony that cost more than most provinces earned in a year. The kingdom watched. The nobility applauded. The crown itself sent emissaries bearing gifts and veiled warnings. And 200 miles to the north, in a forgotten village on the storm-swept cliffs of Ashmere, Seraphina Valhart pressed her hand against her stomach and felt the unmistakable flutter of life moving inside her. She closed her eyes. The wind off the northern sea tasted like salt and iron and the beginning of something that would change the kingdom forever. She did not know yet what she carried, but the throne would. The first winter of the new marriage taught Isolde Ravenshire something that 2 years of strategic observation had failed to reveal. Caedric Vexley did not sleep. Not in the way that busy men slept poorly, collapsing late and waking early with their minds already running calculations. Caedric inhabited a different category entirely. He would lie motionless in the dark for hours with his eyes open, staring at the canopy above their bed as though reading instructions written in the shadows. His breathing never changed. His body never shifted. He simply existed in a state of suspended alertness that Isolde initially mistook for discipline and gradually recognized as damage. She learned not to touch him during these episodes. The one time she had reached for his arm in the dark, his hand had closed around her wrist with a speed and pressure that left bruises for a week. He had not apologized. He had looked at the marks the next morning with an expression that was not remorse but something closer to clinical interest, as though cataloging the evidence of a reflex he had not consciously authorized. "You were dreaming," she told him over breakfast, watching his reaction the way she watched everything, with the patient precision of someone constructing a dossier. "I do not dream," Caedric said. He cut his meat with the mechanical efficiency of a man for whom even eating was a task to be completed rather than experienced. Dreams require surrender. I have never found surrender useful. Isolde smiled and sipped her wine and added the data point to her growing understanding of the machine she had married. She had known, of course, that Caedric Vexley was not a man in the conventional sense. He was an instrument, a weapon that had learned to dress itself in noble clothing and simulate the behaviors of human attachment when politically advantageous. This had not bothered her. Isolde had not married a man. She had married a military infrastructure with a pulse. What bothered her was the discovery that the instrument had a flaw. The flaw had a name, and the name was never spoken aloud in Blackthorn Keep, and the silence surrounding it was so absolute and so enforced that it functioned as a kind of inverted monument, a memorial made of absence that every servant and soldier and visiting lord could feel pressing against their awareness, like a tongue pressing against the socket of a missing tooth. Seraphina. Isolde encountered the ghost of the first wife in places she had not expected, in the way the household staff hesitated a fraction of a second before following Isolde's orders. Not defiance, but the muscular memory of obeying a different voice. In the arrangement of the kitchen gardens, which still followed planting patterns that Seraphina had designed 8 years earlier and that no one had thought to change. In the particular quality of silence that fell over Fenwick's face whenever Isolde mentioned the future, as though the old man was listening to a frequency she could not hear, and in Caedric himself. The flaw manifested as a void. Isolde had spent 3 months in the Duke's bed and 6 months in his confidence, and she had mapped the topology of his mind with cartographic precision. She knew his ambitions, his fears, his strategic blind spots, his physical triggers. She knew that he processed affection as transaction and loyalty as investment, and betrayal as the only sin that warranted permanent retaliation. She knew every corridor of the fortress he had built inside himself. Except one. There was a room he would not enter, a door that remained locked against every key she possessed. Charm, sex, political leverage, intellectual provocation. Behind that door lived whatever Caedric had felt for Seraphina Valhart, and the fact that it remained sealed told Isolde something that altered her entire strategic calculus. He had not discarded his first wife because he had stopped caring. He had discarded her because caring had become an obstacle to the only objective that mattered. The distinction was crucial. A man who had stopped loving was safe. A man who had amputated love while it was still alive was a detonation waiting for a trigger. Isolde adjusted her plans accordingly. Spring came to the Iron Marches with the subtlety of an invasion. Snow retreated, rivers swelled, trade caravans resumed their circuits through Caedric's territories, and with them came the Ravenshire family's real agenda. It arrived in the form of Isolde's brother, Lord Meryn Ravenshire, a man whose smile preceded him into rooms the way scouts preceded an army into hostile terrain. Meryn was 36, handsome in the manufactured way of someone who had never been required to develop substance beneath the surface, and possessed of a confidence so profound it could only have been purchased with inherited wealth. He took up residence in the keep's guest wing and immediately began requesting meetings with Caedric's military commanders. Supply chain consultations, Isolde explained when Caedric raised the issue. They were walking the battlements after the evening meal, a habit that Isolde had cultivated because she understood that Caedric was most candid when in motion. His body's momentum loosened the mechanisms of control that governed his speech when stationary. The Ravenshire trading network can reduce your provisioning costs by a third. Meryn has managed our family's military contracts since he was 22. Your brother has managed the redistribution of other people's military assets since he was 22, Caedric corrected. There is a difference between supply chain management and supply chain parasitism that your family has historically found inconvenient to acknowledge. Harsh words for your in-laws. Accurate words. I married you, Isolde. I did not marry your family's business model. He stopped walking. The wind off the cliffs pressed his cloak against his frame, and for an instant the silhouette he cast against the twilight sky looked less like a man and more like a battlement, another piece of the fortress architecture. Meryn speaks to my commanders with my explicit permission and within boundaries I define. Any conversation that exceeds those boundaries ends the conversation and the relationship. Isolde absorbed the warning with the composure of a woman who had anticipated it 3 moves ago. "Understood, Your Grace." She did not tell him that Marin had already exceeded those boundaries twice. 200 miles north, in the village of Thornhaven on the Ashmere coast, Serafina Veilhart was learning a different kind of survival. The cottage she had rented stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking water so gray it seemed to exist in a permanent state of mourning. The village itself held fewer than 200 people: fishermen, sheep farmers, women who wove sailcloth for the coastal trading vessels. None of them knew her real name. She had introduced herself as Sarah, a widow from the Midlands seeking quiet. The story was thin enough to see through, but the people of Ashmere possessed a quality that Serafina had never encountered in 12 years of court life: the basic human decency of minding their own business. The pregnancy had advanced into its 7th month, and the child inside her had begun to move with a restlessness that reminded her, with aching specificity, of its father. She sat on the cliff's edge most evenings, wrapped in a wool cloak that smelled of salt and wood smoke, and conducted the only conversation that mattered. Not with the child, with herself. The woman who had been Duchess of the Iron Marches was dying, not physically. Physically, she was stronger than she had been in years, fed by clean air and manual labor and the ruthless vitality that survival demanded. But the identity was collapsing. Every day stripped another layer of the person she had constructed to exist within Caedric's world. The strategist, the political operator, the woman who could read a room of hostile lords and disarm them with precision timing and the right word in the right ear at the right moment. That woman had been built for a specific environment, and the environment no longer existed. What remained was something raw, something she did not yet have a name for, but that she recognized in the way it moved through her body, in the way she chopped firewood with an aggression that had nothing to do with heating the cottage, in the way she walked the cliffs at night with a stride that dared the wind to push her, in the way she placed her hand on her belly and felt the child kick and understood with absolute cellular certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it with the full force of whatever she was becoming. The midwife, Elara, was a woman of 60 whose face looked like a map of every storm that had ever hit the Ashmere coast. She visited twice a week, checked Serafina's health with efficient hands, and asked no questions that were not medical. Until one evening in late spring, when the light through the cottage window caught the signet ring that Serafina had forgotten to remove, a ring bearing a crest that even a village midwife on the edge of the known world would recognize. Elara looked at the ring, looked at Serafina, looked at the ring again. "Well," she said, "that explains the posture." Serafina's hand closed involuntarily over the ring. Her pulse spiked, the first time in months that the survival instincts she had developed at court had fired with their full intensity. "It is a family heirloom. It means nothing." "It means Veilhart." Alara's voice carried no judgment, no excitement, no political calculation. It carried the flat certainty of a woman who had delivered hundreds of children and learned that the circumstances of conception mattered far less than the quality of care that followed. "I delivered the Veilhart twins in Kingsmere 40 years ago, your mother's house. That crest has a crack in the raven's left wing that the original silversmith put there by accident and the family kept as a signature." Serafina said nothing. Her mind was running the calculation she had hoped never to run, the assessment of threat posed by a single person possessing information that could destroy the fragile anonymity she had built. Elara watched the calculation happen. She had seen that expression before, on the faces of women who had learned to treat every human interaction as a potential ambush. "I have delivered children for women hiding from worse than a duke," Elara said. "Your secret lives or dies with me, and I choose lives. Now stop clenching your jaw. It raises your blood pressure, and the child does not need that." Serafina exhaled. The sound carried in it the accumulated tension of 7 months of solitary fear. "The child," she said quietly. "If anyone discovers who the father is, then you will deal with it when it comes, not before. Borrowing tomorrow's catastrophe is a luxury for women who have nothing better to do." Elara placed a hand on Serafina's belly with the casual authority of someone who had spent a lifetime touching the future. "This one is strong. Whatever you have been feeding it, anger, grief, stubbornness, it is working." The The boy was born on a night when the northern sea threw itself against the Ashmere cliffs with the fury of something that had been patient too long. Seraphina labored for 11 hours. She did not scream, not because she was brave, but because 12 years of marriage to Caedric Vexley had taught her that sound was information, and information in the wrong ears was a weapon pointed at your throat. She named him Lucy Yan. It was her grandfather's name, a man who had served the royal house before the current dynasty's corruption had made service indistinguishable from complicity. The name meant light, and she chose it not for sentiment, but for defiance. The boy would carry brightness into whatever darkness awaited him, and he would do it with a name that owed nothing to the Vexley legacy. Alara cleaned the child with practiced hands and placed him against Seraphina's chest, and in that moment, skin against skin, heartbeat answering heartbeat, something inside Seraphina completed a transformation that had begun the night she walked out of Caedric's study. The strategist was gone. The Duchess was gone. The woman who had defined herself in relation to the most powerful man in Valadorn was gone. What remained was a mother, and a mother with Seraphina Valhart's mind and Seraphina Valhart's training and Seraphina Valhart's intimate knowledge of exactly how the kingdom's power structures could be dismantled was not a woman to be pitied. She was a woman to be feared. Back at Blackthorn Keep, the fractures Isolde had introduced into Caedric's empire were spreading with the patient inevitability of ice forming in stone. Lord Fenwick brought the evidence on a Tuesday. He entered Caedric's study without knocking, a privilege earned through 3 decades of service and the particular moral authority of a man who had never once lied to his duke. "Sit down," Fenwick said. "I do not take instructions in my own study, Aldous." "Then stand, but you will want to be still for this." Fenwick placed a leather folio on the desk. Inside were shipping manifests, treasury withdrawal records, and correspondence bearing seals from 4 different noble houses, all routed through a single intermediary. "Your wife's brother has been rerouting military supply contracts through Ravenshire Shell Holdings for 5 months. The markup is between 40 and 60% depending on the commodity. The total siphoned from your treasury to date is approximately 900,000 gold crowns." Caedric did not move. He read the documents with the focused intensity of a man disarming an explosive device. Methodical, precise, aware that every detail mattered, and that the mechanism was designed to destroy him if he missed a single wire. "Isolde," he said. It was not a question. "The contracts require dual authorization, your seal and the household seal. The household seal has been in your wife's possession since the marriage." Fenwick's voice carried no satisfaction. It carried the heavy exhaustion of a man who had warned against this exact outcome and taken no pleasure in being right. "She has been signing off on every diversion. The trail is meticulous. Whoever designed this expected it to run for years before detection." Caedric set the documents down. His hands were steady. His breathing had not changed, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, the way the stillness of a coiled spring differs from the stillness of a stone. One is waiting. The other has simply stopped. Who else knows? No one. I conducted the audit personally. Keep it that way. Caedric. Fenwick used the Duke's given name, something he permitted himself once or twice a year, always at moments when the formality of titles would have been an insult to the gravity of the situation. This is not a financial problem. This is an occupation. The Ravenshires are inside your walls, inside your treasury, inside your command structure. Marin has met with 6 of your 12 senior commanders in the past month alone. He is not consulting on supply chains. He is building a network of obligations that will answer to Ravenshire interests when the time comes. When what time comes? When they no longer need you. The words landed in the study like a body hitting stone from a great height. Caedric turned to the window. Beyond the glass, the iron marches stretched toward the horizon. Every field, every road, every village, a tile in the mosaic of power he had spent 20 years assembling. He had starved for this empire. He had killed for it. He had amputated the one person who understood him to secure the political alliance that would elevate it beyond the reach of any rival. And that political alliance was eating him alive from the inside. He thought of Seraphina. Not intentionally. The thought arrived the way a blade arrives in a wound, fast and deep, and from a direction he had not been watching. He thought of her standing in this exact room, telling him that Isolde Ravenshire was a threat he was choosing not to see. He thought of the precision of her warning and the accuracy of her prediction and the 12 years of partnership he had incinerated for the promise of a crown that was now revealed to be nothing more than bait on a hook designed to land him in someone else's net. The thought lasted 3 seconds. He killed it the way he killed all thoughts that threatened the structural integrity of his decisions, by converting emotion into action. Marin leaves the keep by week's end, he said. Isolde's access to the household seal is revoked immediately. The compromised contracts are to be audited, renegotiated, and reassigned to suppliers with no Ravenshire connections. And Isolde herself? Caedric's jaw worked. The muscles beneath the skin moved like machinery adjusting under load. Isolde remains. A divorce would signal weakness to every house in the kingdom. She stays, she loses her financial access, and she learns what it means to live inside a cage she helped build. He turned from the window. His eyes held the flat luminosity of a man who had just discovered that the war he thought was external had been internal all along. I underestimated them, Aldous. You underestimated her. I underestimated myself. I believed I could purchase what I needed without paying the actual price. He picked up the folio and held it the way he once held campaign maps, as a blueprint for destruction. That era ends tonight. Fenwick nodded and rose to leave. At the door, he paused. There is something else. Rumors from the northern provinces. Unconfirmed. A woman matching Seraphina's description living in a coastal village in Ashmere. Caedric's thoughts tightened on the folio. The leather creaked. And the rumor includes a child, an infant son. The silence that followed was not the calculated silence Caedric deployed as a weapon in council chambers. It was the silence of a man hearing a sound from very far away, a sound that he recognized, that he had been dreading without knowing he was dreading it, that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about the consequences of his choices. A son. The rumor is unconfirmed, Fenwick repeated. Confirm it. Carefully or quickly? Both. Fenwick left. The door closed behind him with a sound that should have been ordinary, but that carried, for the first time in the history of Blackthorn Keep, the specific weight of a world about to split open along a fault line that had been forming since the night Caedric Vexley chose a crown over the only woman who ever told him the truth. Caedric stood alone in his study. He set the folio down. He placed both hands flat on the desk and leaned forward until his weight rested on his knuckles. And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since the night Seraphina walked out of this room and did not slam the door, the machinery inside him produced a sound he could not classify as strategy or anger or calculated response. It was fear. Not the fear of a threatened ruler, the fear of a man who had just realized that the most dangerous thing in the kingdom was not the conspiracy inside his walls or the enemies beyond his borders. It was the life he had thrown away. And that life had just produced an heir. Fenwick's rider returned to Blackthorn Keep on a horse that had been driven to the edge of collapse. The animal's flanks were streaked with dried sweat, and its legs trembled as it stood in the courtyard, sides heaving in the gray morning light. The rider dismounted, asked for the Duke by name, and was escorted to the study within minutes. Caedric read the sealed report standing. The confirmation was clinical. A woman matching Seraphina Veilhart's description had been living in the coastal village of Thornhaven in the Ashmere province for approximately 9 months under the name Sarah. She had given birth to a male infant roughly 3 months prior. The child was healthy. The woman had no visible means of noble support and appeared to be living on savings and the limited income of a seamstress. She had no guards, no servants, no defensive infrastructure of any kind. Caedric read the report twice. Then a third time, slower, with the attention of a man searching for the specific detail that would tell him how afraid to be. He found it in the final line. The village midwife has confirmed Valhart lineage through a family signet ring bearing a cracked raven's wing. No further investigation was conducted per your instructions to avoid alerting the subject. He set the report down and placed both hands on the desk. A son. The word detonated inside a part of his mind he had spent months sealing shut. Not an abstract concept, not a rumor or a political inconvenience. A living child. His blood. growing in a fishing village 200 miles from the empire Caedric had built to be unassailable, completely unprotected by any of its walls or armies or mechanisms of power. Aldous. He summoned Fenwick within the hour. The old man entered the study looking as though he had not slept, which was accurate. The report confirms everything. The child exists. A boy? Yes. Your heir. The word hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire neither of them had started. Caedric walked to the window. Below, the morning routine of Blackthorn Keep continued. Soldiers drilling in formation, servants hauling provisions, grooms leading war horses to exercise yards. The machinery of empire, running on the fuel of fear and efficiency. Every piece in place, every function accounted for, except one. "What are you going to do?" Fenwick asked. "I have not decided." "That is a decision in itself. Every hour you spend deliberating is an hour during which your son is unguarded in a village with no walls and no garrison, and the rumor of his existence is spreading through the same channels that your enemies use to plan your destruction." Caedric turned. "Do not lecture me about vulnerability, Aldous. I built this keep on the understanding that vulnerability is the only resource I cannot afford. And yet you created the most vulnerable target in the kingdom by casting out the woman carrying your child." Fenwick did not flinch from the Duke's stare. He had earned this particular defiance through 30 years of telling hard truths to men who killed people for less. "The Ravenshirs will hear about this, if they have not already. The Ravenshires are contained. Merrin has been expelled. Isolde's financial access is severed. Contained is not eliminated. You cut their funding. You did not cut their ambition." Fenwick sat without being invited. The presumption would have cost any other man his position. "They have spent 4 generations building proximity to the crown. Do you believe they will accept a reduced role quietly? Do you believe Isolde will sit in her chambers and embroider while her family's entire investment collapses around her? Isolde will do what I tell her to do. Isolde will do what serves Isolde. That has been the organizing principle of her existence since before you met her, and your marriage did not alter it. It merely gave it better infrastructure." Fenwick leaned forward. "Send protection to Ashmere. Tonight. A small detail. 4 men, no Vexley insignia, nothing that attracts attention. Secure the child and his mother until you determine the political implications." Caedric stared at Fenwick for a long time. The kind of stare that other men could not sustain, but that Fenwick absorbed the way cliffs absorb weather, with an endurance born of having been battered too many times to care. "I will handle it," Caedric said. He did not send protection that night. The machinery of his mind, the apparatus of strategy and calculation that governed every decision, was running scenarios at a speed that left no room for the simple, urgent action Fenwick had recommended. He was calculating political exposure, succession implications, the reaction of the noble houses, the response of the crown, the weaponization potential of an unacknowledged heir. Every variable received its own weight and its own analysis and its own contingency plan. And while the Duke of the Iron Marches sat in his study running the mathematics of power, 300 miles of unguarded road stretched between his walls and his son. The mathematics took 4 days. The assassins took 3. They came to Thornhaven on a night when the fog rolled in from the northern sea so thick it erased the boundary between water and land. 7 men, professional, wearing no insignia, carrying weapons designed for close quarters killing, short blades, garroting wire, a single crossbow with bolts tipped in something dark that was not iron. Seraphina heard them before she saw them. Not their footsteps. Professionals did not produce footsteps. She heard the silence, the specific quality of silence that descends on a village when the dogs stop barking all at once, not because the threat has passed, but because the threat is sophisticated enough to have dealt with the dogs first. She was out of bed in 3 seconds. Lucian slept in a woven basket beside her cot. She scooped him up with one hand and a blanket with the other and pressed herself against the wall beside the cottage door, breathing through her nose, her heartbeat, a controlled percussion that she regulated the way Caedric had once taught her during the border siege of their 3rd year. Slow in, hold, slow out. Fear is a luxury. Manage the body first. The mind follows. The door splintered inward. The first man through died on the fireplace poker that Seraphina drove into his throat. She did not aim for the throat intentionally, she aimed for the center of mass, and his momentum carried him forward into a downward trajectory that redirected the iron rod upward through the soft tissue beneath his jaw. The sound he made was wet and abbreviated, and Seraphina was already past him before his body completed its collapse. The second man was faster. His blade caught the edge of her shoulder as she twisted through the doorway, opening a cut that ran from collarbone to the top of her arm. The pain registered as information rather than sensation. Damage sustained, mobility reduced, adapt accordingly. She ran, not toward the village, toward the cliffs. 12 years of marriage to a military strategist had taught her principles she had absorbed so deeply they functioned as instinct. When outnumbered, do not seek allies. Seek terrain. Terrain does not betray you. Terrain does not negotiate. Terrain is the only weapon that cannot be purchased by your enemies. The cliff path was a narrow track cut into the rock face by generations of fishermen who needed access to the tidal pools below. In daylight, it was treacherous. In fog, with a 3-month-old infant pressed against her chest and blood running down her arm, it was suicide. Seraphina took it at a run. 2 of the assassins followed. The path narrowed to 18 inches wide. Below, the sea churned against rocks with a sound like grinding bone. Seraphina moved with the desperate precision of someone operating beyond the boundaries of what their body could normally accomplish. Adrenaline converting every muscle fiber into raw forward momentum, her bare feet finding holds on wet stone through some combination of instinct and refusal to die. Lucien did not cry. He pressed against her chest with the focused stillness of an infant who had somehow, at 3 months old, inherited his mother's understanding that sound was information and silence was survival. The lead assassin gained ground. His breathing was controlled, professional, the measured respiration of a man who killed people for money, and had learned that cardiovascular management was as important as blade work. He was 6 feet behind her when the path widened into a rocky ledge overlooking a 40-foot drop to the water, dead end. Seraphina turned. The assassins stopped. For a moment they occupied the same geography in very different ways. He with the confidence of a man who had cornered his target, she with the incandescent focus of a woman who had just realized that the only exit was through. "The child," the assassin said. "We were told just the child." "You were told wrong." She kicked a loose stone the size of a fist directly into his leading knee. The joint buckled sideways with a sound like green wood cracking, and as he staggered forward, she drove her palm into his nose with enough force to send bone fragments into the space behind his eyes. He fell sideways off the ledge without a sound, and the sea received him the way it received everything, without judgment and without return. The second assassin did not advance. He stood on the narrow path and stared at the woman bleeding on the cliff's edge, holding a silent infant against her chest, standing over the space where his partner had just disappeared, and something in his professional calculation shifted. This was not the target they had been briefed on. This was not a frightened noblewoman hiding in a fishing village. This was something else entirely. He retreated. Seraphina stood on the ledge until the fog swallowed him completely. Then her legs failed. She dropped to her knees on the wet stone, curled her body around Lucien, and shook with the full-body tremor of a nervous system releasing its grip on crisis mode. The shaking lasted 4 minutes. She timed it, 4 minutes of involuntary physical collapse, while the blood from her shoulder wound dripped onto the stone and mixed with seawater spray and the night pressed down around her like a fist closing. Then she stopped shaking. She stood. She walked back up the cliff path to the village. 3 of the assassins were dead. 1 from her fireplace poker, 1 from the cliff, 1 from a fisherman named Corwin who owned a boat hook and a deep personal objection to armed strangers entering his village at night. The remaining 4 had vanished into the fog, but they had left something behind. In the cottage, scattered across the floor among the debris of the shattered door, Seraphina found a leather satchel that the first assassin had been carrying. Inside were documents, payment records, correspondence, and a genealogical chart that stopped her blood cold. Lara found her an hour later, sitting on the floor of the destroyed cottage with Lucien sleeping against her chest and the genealogical chart spread across her knees. The midwife took one look at the shoulder wound and began cleaning it without asking what had happened. The evidence was self-explanatory. "The chart," Serafina said. Her voice had the flat quality of someone speaking from inside a state of shock so profound it had crossed into a kind of terrible clarity. "They were carrying a genealogical chart of my maternal line." "Your mother's family?" "The Valharts, going back 7 generations." Serafina's finger traced a line on the parchment that moved through names and dates and marriage records with the precision of a legal document prepared for formal submission. "My mother's grandmother was Elowyn Ashcroft. Before her marriage, she was Elowyn Draymont." Alara's hands paused mid-stitch. "Draymont," the midwife repeated. The royal house of Draymont held the crown for 4 generations before the current dynasty took power. The official record states that the Draymont line ended when King Aldrich Draymont died without legitimate heirs. Serafina's finger stopped at a name near the bottom of the chart. "The official record is wrong. Aldrich had a daughter who was married into the Ashcroft family before the succession crisis. The bloodline continued, through the Ashcrofts to the Valharts." She looked up at Alara with eyes that held no triumph, no excitement, no political calculation. They held the pure, unfiltered terror of a woman who had just understood why 7 men had come to kill her infant son in the middle of the night. "Lucien is not just Caedric's heir, he is the last legitimate descendant of the royal house, the only living person with a lawful claim to the throne of Valadorn." Alara finished the last stitch in silence. Outside, the fog was lifting. Dawn crept over the Ashmere cliffs with the tentative quality of light entering a room where something terrible has happened. Serafina held the genealogical chart and felt the weight of its implications settling onto her shoulders like armor she had not asked to wear. Someone had paid professional assassins to kill a 3-month-old child. Someone who knew about the bloodline. Someone who understood that this infant represented a legitimate threat to the current power structure of the entire kingdom. She looked at the payment records. The amounts were staggering, the kind of money that moved through noble treasuries, not mercenary contracts. The correspondence was carefully sanitized, routed through intermediaries, stripped of identifying seals. But the routing numbers matched a pattern Serafina recognized. She had spent 12 years managing the household accounts of Blackthorn Keep. She knew Caedric's financial architecture the way she knew the layout of her own body. Every channel, every junction, every place where the flow of resources could be diverted or concealed. And the routing pattern in these payment records did not originate from the Ravenshire network. It did not originate from any of the hostile noble houses that might benefit from eliminating a rival heir. It originated from inside Blackthorn Keep itself, from accounts that only 3 people had ever possessed the authority to access: Caedric, Isolde, and Fenwick. The realization did not arrive as a shock. It arrived as a rearrangement. The sickening sensation of watching every piece of trusted information shift position simultaneously, the way furniture shifts during an earthquake, revealing that the floor you had been standing on was never solid to begin with. Fenwick, who had watched her leave Blackthorn Keep from the eastern battlement, who had been the only person to watch her go, who had brought the evidence against the Ravenshires with such meticulous timing that it accomplished 2 things simultaneously. It positioned him as Caedric's most trusted advisor while diverting all suspicion toward Isolde and her family, who had dispatched the rider to confirm Serafina's location and the child's existence, and who had received the rider's report before anyone else in the keep, who had asked Caedric in that study, "What are you going to do?" and had listened to the answer with the patient attention of a man calculating exactly how much time he had before the Duke acted. 4 days. Fenwick had heard Caedric say, "I will handle it," and he had known that Caedric's handling would involve the deliberate, methodical analysis that consumed days rather than hours. 4 days of mathematical certainty, during which the old man who had earned trust through 30 years of honest service dispatched 7 killers to a fishing village to murder an infant in his sleep. Serafina pressed her hand against her mouth and breathed through her fingers. Why? The question burned through her mind like acid through parchment. Fenwick had served the Vexley family for 3 decades. He had known Caedric since boyhood. He had stood in that study and spoken with the moral authority of a man whose loyalty was beyond question. Then the second realization hit, and it was worse than the first. Fenwick had served the Vexley family, but before the Vexleys he had served the crown. His early career, the years before Caedric's father had recruited him, had been spent in the royal treasury. He had been a crown man first, a Vexley man second, and the crown had every reason to want the last Draymont heir dead. The genealogical chart was not evidence the assassins had brought for reference. It was evidence they had been given by whoever commissioned the killing, a document that proved the target's identity and justified the elimination of a bloodline that threatened the current dynasty's legitimacy. Fenwick had not discovered the Ravenshire conspiracy. He had amplified it. He had fed Caedric the evidence at precisely the moment when it would maximize the Duke's distraction, turning Caedric's attention inward toward his treacherous wife, while Fenwick operated outward toward the real target, the child whose existence endangered not merely the Vexley succession, but the stability of the throne itself. 30 years of service, 30 years of carefully cultivated trust, 30 years of positioning himself as the one man in Blackthorn Keep whose counsel could be accepted without inspection. All of it infrastructure, all of it preparation, all of it aimed at this moment, the moment when the last legitimate heir to the royal house drew breath in a coastal village, and the man tasked with protecting the current dynasty's interests was perfectly placed to ensure that breath was extinguished before anyone understood what it meant. Serafina stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, weighted with the kind of resolution that does not require adrenaline because it operates at a depth that adrenaline cannot reach. She looked down at Lucien, sleeping. His face carried the compressed potential of both his parents, Caedric's jaw already forming in miniature, Serafina's dark auburn hair visible as a soft haze across his skull. This child was not merely her son. He was the future of a kingdom that did not yet know it needed him. And the most dangerous man in his life was not the Duke who had abandoned him or the assassins who had come to kill him. It was the quiet, aging advisor who sat at the Duke's right hand and had been betraying them all with a patience that made Isolde Ravenshire's schemes look like a child's tantrum. "Alara," Serafina said, "I need a horse. I need provisions for a week's travel, and I need to disappear from this village within the hour." "Where will you go?" Serafina folded the genealogical chart and placed it inside her cloak. The payment records followed. The correspondence. Every piece of evidence that connected Fenwick to the assassination attempt, assembled with the organizational precision of a woman who had spent 12 years managing intelligence for the most powerful duke in the kingdom. "I am going to Blackthorn Keep." Alara stared at her. "You are going back to the man who cast you out." "I am going back to warn the man who cast me out that his most trusted advisor is working for the crown, and has been for 30 years. Serafina's voice carried something that Alara had never heard in it before. Not anger, not fear, not the controlled determination of a woman in survival mode. Something older, something that lived in the space between strategy and fury, between the mother protecting her child and the Duchess reclaiming the battlefield she had been driven from. Caedric does not know what he is. He does not know what Lucien is. And if Fenwick reaches him with his version of events before I reach him with the truth, then my son dies, and the kingdom falls into the hands of men who have been manufacturing its future from the shadows for 3 decades. She lifted Lucien from the basket and held him against her chest. The boy stirred, opened his eyes, and looked at his mother with the unfocused clarity of an infant who does not yet understand the world, but somehow recognizes the precise moment when the world changes. "I left Blackthorn Keep as a discarded wife," Serafina said. "I am returning as something else entirely. And when I walk through those gates, Aldous Fenwick is going to learn what it costs to threaten my son." Dawn broke fully over Ashmere. The fog had cleared and the northern sea lay flat and bright beneath a sky scraped clean by the same storm that had covered the assassin's approach. On the cliff road leading south, a woman on a borrowed horse rode toward the iron marches with a sleeping infant strapped to her chest and a collection of documents that would crack the foundations of the most powerful duchy in the kingdom. Behind her, the fishing village of Thornhaven returned to its rhythms. Ahead of her, Blackthorn Keep waited, its black towers rising from the cliffs like a monument to every lie that power tells itself about the nature of loyalty. And inside those towers, Aldous Fenwick sat at the Duke's breakfast table, sipping wine, reviewing treasury reports, performing with surgical precision the role of the faithful servant. Unaware that the woman he had tried to kill was riding toward him with the evidence of his betrayal, and the fury of a mother who had just discovered that the most dangerous game in Valadorn was not the Game of Thrones. It was the game of trust, and every player at the table had just lost. The southern road to the Iron Marches ran through 200 miles of terrain that had been designed by geography to punish anyone foolish enough to cross it in a hurry. Dense forest gave way to exposed moorland. Moorland collapsed into river valleys swollen with spring runoff. The valleys climbed into the rocky foothills that formed the natural defense perimeter of Caedric Vexley's empire. Terrain so hostile that 3 separate invading armies had turned back over the past century without ever reaching the keep itself. Seraphina covered it in 4 days. She rode the way she had once managed Blackthorn Keep's accounts, with ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for waste. She slept in 2-hour intervals, dismounting to rest the horse while Lucien nursed, then resuming before the cold could settle into her muscles. The shoulder wound from the assassin's blade had been stitched clean by Alara, but infection was a patient enemy, and by the second day the skin around the sutures had begun radiating a heat that had nothing to do with exertion. She ignored it. Pain was data. Data informed decisions. Decisions kept her son alive. On the morning of the 4th day, Blackthorn Keep appeared on the horizon like a scar cut into the cliff face. Its black towers rose against a sky the color of wet steel, and the sight of them produced in Seraphina's chest a response so complex she could not have named it if she had tried. Rage and recognition and the peculiar vertigo of returning to a place that had been home and prison simultaneously. She did not enter through the main gate. 12 years of residency had taught her every service entrance, every supply corridor, every passage that the household staff used to move through the keep without crossing the paths of nobility. She entered through the eastern postern gate, a narrow door set into the cliff wall that opened onto the kitchens, using a key she had never returned because no one had thought to ask for it, because no one had imagined she would ever come back. The kitchen staff froze when they saw her, not from surprise, from the particular paralysis that occurs when reality contradicts everything you have been told to believe. The former Duchess of the Iron Marches stood in their workspace, bleeding through a travel cloak with an infant strapped to her chest, and every face in the room registered the same calculation. Do we report this? And if so, to whom? "Where is the Duke?" Seraphina asked. The head cook, a woman named Marta who had served the keep for 20 years, recovered first. "The War Council chamber, my lady. He has been there since dawn. There are reports. I know about the reports. Take this child. Feed him goat's milk if he wakes. Do not tell anyone he is here. Do not tell anyone I am here. If Aldous Fenwick asks you anything at all, you have seen nothing." Marta looked at the infant, looked at Seraphina's face, understood without further explanation that whatever was happening exceeded the normal parameters of household politics by a margin that did not bear contemplation. "Yes, my lady." Seraphina handed Lucien to Marta. The transfer required her to physically override every instinct in her body. The maternal circuitry that had rewired itself over 3 months of constant proximity screaming that separation from this child was synonymous with death. She overrode it the way she overrode everything that interfered with operational necessity. With force, with precision, with the understanding that protecting Lucien now meant walking into the most dangerous room in the keep without him. The War Council chamber occupied the central floor of the main tower. Its walls were lined with maps, campaign territories, troop dispositions, supply routes, each one annotated in Caedric's handwriting with the obsessive detail of a man who trusted no one else to record information accurately. A stone table dominated the center of the room, large enough to seat 12. This morning it seated 4, Caedric at the head, Lord Fenwick at his right hand, Commander Draven, head of the keep's garrison, across from Fenwick, and Isolde, seated at the far end with the studied composure of a woman who had been demoted but not dismissed. The tension in the room was structural, built into the arrangement of bodies, the angles of eye contact, the specific quality of silence that accumulated between people who no longer trusted each other but had not yet determined who would move first. Caedric was speaking when the door opened. The northern garrisons report movement along the... He stopped. Every head in the room turned. Seraphina stood in the doorway, travel-stained, blood on her cloak, the wound on her shoulder visible where the fabric had torn during 4 days of riding. Her hair was matted. Her boots were caked with mud from 3 river crossings. She looked like someone who had crawled out of a disaster that had not yet finished happening. She looked directly at Fenwick. The old man's face underwent a transformation so rapid it would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically watching for it. Shock, the involuntary widening of the pupils, the fractional parting of the lips, then recognition, then the smooth, practiced recalibration of a man who had spent 30 years controlling the surface of his expression while the machinery beneath it ran calculations that had nothing to do with what his face was showing. Seraphina. Caedric's voice carried the specific flatness of a man who has been presented with information his mind has not yet consented to process. What are you doing here? Surviving an assassination attempt that your most trusted advisor commissioned. The sentence detonated in the chamber like something incendiary thrown into a confined space. Commander Draven's hand moved instinctively toward his sword. Isolde's composure cracked for the first time since Seraphina had known her. A visible fracture in the mask that revealed something underneath that was not fear or anger, but the frantic recalculation of a woman whose strategic position had just been demolished by an entrance she had not anticipated. Fenwick did not move. That was what convinced Seraphina she was right. An innocent man accused of commissioning murder in front of his duke would react. He would stand. He would protest. He would display the outrage of someone whose honor had been attacked without cause. Fenwick did none of these things. He sat in his chair with his hands folded on the table and looked at Seraphina with an expression of mild concern that was so precisely calibrated it could only have been rehearsed. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "You appear to have been through an ordeal. Perhaps you should sit, and we can..." 7 men, professional killers, arrived at the village of Thornhaven 3 nights ago, killed the dogs first to eliminate the alarm, broke down my door, attempted to murder my 3-month-old son in his sleep. Seraphina crossed the room and placed the leather satchel on the stone table with a controlled violence that made Draven flinch. Payment records, correspondence, a genealogical chart of my maternal lineage tracing the Draymont bloodline through the Ashcroft family to the Valeharts, commissioned by someone with access to Crown Treasury routing channels and intimate knowledge of Blackthorn Keep's financial architecture. She opened the satchel and spread the documents across the table. The payment records landed in front of Caedric. The genealogical chart she positioned where every person in the room could see it. The routing numbers match accounts that only 3 people in this keep have authorization to access. You, Caedric, Isolde, and the man sitting at your right hand who has been working for the crown since before your father recruited him. Fenwick exhaled through his nose. The sound was almost amused. Almost. "This is grief talking," he said, his voice carrying the measured compassion of a counselor addressing a traumatized patient. "The woman has been through a terrible experience, and she is reaching for explanations that confirm her emotional..." "The routing numbers, Aldous." Caedric's voice cut through the room like a blade through fabric. He was not looking at Seraphina. He was looking at the payment records. His eyes moved across the figures with the speed of a man who knew his own financial systems the way he knew his own heartbeat, and what they were telling him had drained the blood from his face. Account Series 774, subsection Delta, discretionary funds allocated for intelligence operations. Your Grace, those accounts have been used for legitimate... Those accounts have been used by you, exclusively, since I granted you oversight of the intelligence budget 9 years ago. Caedric raised his eyes from the documents. The expression on his face was unlike anything Seraphina had seen in 12 years of marriage. Not anger, not betrayal, not the cold strategic fury he deployed against enemies. Something raw. Something that lived in the space between comprehension and collapse. The expression of a man staring at the wreckage of the most fundamental assumption of his adult life. You sent those men. I protected the stability of this duchy. The confession was so quiet and so immediate that it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The impact deceptively small, the ripples catastrophic. "The child is a Draymont," Fenwick continued. His voice had changed. The avuncular warmth was gone. replaced by something stripped down and mechanical. The actual voice of a man who had been performing a character for 3 decades and had just stepped out of costume. The last legitimate heir to the royal house. Do you understand what that means? Not for your marriage, not for your personal regrets, for the kingdom. Every noble house in Valadorn will split over that child's claim. The crown will mobilize. Civil war becomes inevitable. Not possible. Inevitable. So you decided to kill an infant. Caedric's words were barely above a whisper. The whisper was worse than shouting. It carried a compression that suggested enormous force channeled through a very small opening. I decided to prevent a catastrophe. The same way I have been preventing catastrophes in this keep for 30 years, while you played conquer and convinced yourself that military expansion was the same thing as governance. Fenwick stood. He had the posture of a man who has carried a secret so long that releasing it felt less like exposure and more like setting down a weight that had been destroying his spine. I served the crown before I served your father. I have served the crown every day since. Not out of disloyalty to you, out of the recognition that your ambitions, unchecked, would destroy the very kingdom you claim to be building. Someone had to maintain the balance. Someone had to ensure that a duke drunk on his own power did not produce an heir capable of toppling the dynasty. And when I married Isolde? When the Ravenshears began dismantling my treasury from the inside? I accelerated the exposure of the Ravenshire operation because it served both purposes. It weakened a genuine internal threat while positioning me to locate and eliminate the greater threat. Your son. Serafina watched Caedric's hands. They rested on the table on either side of the payment records, and they were trembling. Not with fear, with the specific seismic activity of a man whose internal architecture was fracturing along fault lines he had not known existed. Fenwick was not an enemy who had infiltrated his defenses. Fenwick was the defense. 30 years of counsel, of guidance, of the one voice Caedric had permitted past every barrier he had constructed. All of it compromised. All of it instrumental. All of it aimed at managing the Duke the way a handler manages an asset. Caedric had spent his entire life building walls against betrayal, and the deepest betrayal had been the architect of those walls. Draven, Caedric said. The commander straightened. Your Grace. Take Lord Fenwick to the tower cells. Post a 4-man guard. No visitors. Fenwick did not resist as Draven's men took his arms. At the door he paused and looked back at Caedric with an expression that contained no remorse, no defiance, no appeal. It contained something closer to exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had spent 3 decades performing a version of himself that had consumed the original. You will wish you had listened to me, Fenwick said. When the noble houses learn about the child, when the crown mobilizes, when your empire fractures along the same lines that have destroyed every overextended duke in the history of this kingdom, you will wish I had finished what I started in that village. The door closed behind him. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound of 3 people reassessing the geometry of their lives in real time. The grinding of assumptions against new information, the structural groaning of worldviews adjusting under loads they were not designed to bear. Isolde spoke first. The Draymont bloodline. If that chart is accurate, it is accurate, Serafina said. Then your son is not merely an heir to the Iron Marches. He is a legitimate claimant to the throne, and every house in the kingdom that has been looking for leverage against the crown just found it. Isolde's mind was running the political calculations with a speed that Serafina recognized, and despite everything, reluctantly respected. The Ashfords, the Thorncrofts, the Southern Alliance. They will rally to the child's claim not because they care about the Draymont legacy, but because a puppet king is more useful than a strong one. And the crown will send more than 7 assassins next time, Serafina said. The crown will send an army. Caedric had not spoken since ordering Fenwick's arrest. He stood at the table with his hands flat on the stone surface, and the expression on his face had settled into something that Serafina recognized from the early years of their marriage. The look he wore when a military situation had deteriorated beyond the reach of conventional strategy, and the only remaining option was the one that required burning everything he had built and starting from the wreckage. "Where's the child?" he asked. "In the kitchen, with Marta." "You left my son in the kitchen." I left our son with the only person in this keep I trust because the person you trusted most just tried to murder him. The word R landed between them like a blade embedding itself in wood. Caedric's jaw worked, the muscles in his neck corded. His breathing shifted into the pattern Seraphina recognized as the precursor to either violence or decision. The deep, controlled rhythm of a man's body preparing to commit to something irreversible. Bring him to me. The sentence carried a weight that exceeded its 4 words. It was not a command. It was not a request. It was a capitulation. The sound of a man who had spent 2 years avoiding the consequences of his choices finally turning to face them. Seraphina did not move. Why? Because he is my son, and I have never seen his face, and I am asking you to bring him to me. Asking. The word came from Caedric Vexley's mouth, like a foreign language being spoken for the first time, awkward, unnatural, requiring a rearrangement of the entire apparatus of communication that had governed his interactions for 20 years. Seraphina left the chamber and returned with Lucien in her arms. The boy was awake, his dark eyes moving across the unfamiliar stone walls with the focused attention of an infant cataloging new information. He had his mother's coloring, auburn hair, pale skin, but the jaw was already Caedric's, and the way his gaze settled on objects with an intensity that bordered on confrontational was unmistakably his father's inheritance. Caedric looked at his son, the Duke of the Iron Marches, who had faced cavalry charges and assassination attempts, and the political machinery of an entire kingdom without flinching, stood in his war council chamber and looked at a 3-month-old boy and could not breathe. The child looked back at him. For 3 seconds, nothing in the room moved. Isolde was forgotten. The political crisis was forgotten. The fractured empire, the imprisoned advisor, the approaching threat of royal retaliation, all of it dissolved into the single overwhelming reality of a man seeing his child for the first time and understanding, with a clarity that bypassed every rational mechanism he possessed, that this was the thing, not the keep, not the army, not the territories or the gold or the throne he had traded his marriage to pursue. This small, undefended, impossibly vulnerable life was the only thing he had ever produced that was worth the cost of producing it. The moment lasted 3 seconds. Then the world collapsed back into the room. A horn sounded from the outer wall. Then another. Then a cascade of horns rippling across the keep's defensive perimeter like a wave of sound rolling inland from a distant storm. Draven burst through the chamber door. Riders approaching from the south, 3 columns, banners of House Thorncroft, House Ashford, and a 3rd column bearing no colors. How many? Caedric asked. Scouts estimate 3,000, possibly more behind the tree line. The unmarked column. Crown troops, stripped of insignia to maintain deniability. Caedric closed his eyes. When he opened them, the man who had stood paralyzed before his infant son was gone. In his place stood something older, something forged in campaigns and sieges, and the understanding that when the mathematics of survival reduce to a single variable, sentiment becomes the first casualty. Fenwick's arrest was the trigger, he said. He had contingencies. The moment he was taken, someone in this keep sent riders to every faction that had been waiting for a signal. He turned to Draven. How long before they reached the walls? Dawn. Maybe sooner if they pushed through the night. Our garrison's strength. 1,200. Against 3,000 or more, with the keep's defensive advantage, we hold for 3 days, maybe 4. After that, supply lines collapse, and they starve us out. Caedric turned to Seraphina. The look they exchanged carried more information than any conversation they had ever had. 12 years of shared strategy compressed into a single glance that acknowledged the situation, assessed the options, and arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. They were outnumbered. The keep was defensible but not impregnable. The enemy coalition included houses motivated by greed, a crown motivated by survival, and an unknown number of internal conspirators whose loyalty to Fenwick had not yet been tested. The only strategic asset they possessed that their enemies could not match was the legitimacy of the claim sleeping in Seraphina's arms. The northern provinces, Seraphina said. Ashmere, Thornhaven. The fishing villages, the farming communities, the people who have never benefited from noble rule and have no loyalty to the current dynasty. Common people cannot fight a professional army. Common people do not need to fight a professional army. They need to deny its supply lines, obstruct its movement, and make the cost of occupation so high that the political calculus shifts. She spoke with the rapid precision of someone who had been running this scenario in her mind for days. Since the night on the cliff, since the moment she understood what Lucian's bloodline meant. The Crown is sending unmarked troops because it cannot afford to be seen waging open war against a legitimate Draymont heir. If we force the engagement into the open, if we make it impossible to deny, the Crown's position collapses. They are relying on deniability. We take that away, and they have nothing. Caedric stared at her. For the first time in their history, he was looking at Serafina not as a wife, not as a partner, not as a strategist whose counsel he valued and occasionally resented. He was looking at her as a commander, a woman who had walked 200 miles through hostile territory with a wounded shoulder and an infant on her chest, and arrived not broken, not desperate, but prepared. Prepared with intelligence, prepared with strategy, prepared with the kind of clarity that only emerges when a person has been stripped of everything except the one thing they are willing to die for. I need to address the garrison, Caedric said. Every soldier in this keep needs to understand what they are defending and why. Not the walls, not the Duke, the heir. They will not fight for an heir they have never seen. Then they will see him. Caedric looked at Lucian. The boy was watching his father with the unblinking focus that was becoming his signature, a gaze that would, in years to come, remind every person who encountered it of the Duke at his most formidable. My son stands on those walls at dawn. The kingdom sees what it has been trying to destroy, and every man holding a sword in this keep understands that what is behind him is worth more than what is in front of him. Draven waited at the door. Your Grace, your orders. Caedric drew his sword. The blade caught the torchlight and threw it across the stone walls in fractured patterns that looked like the map of a kingdom coming apart. Every gate sealed, every wall manned, archers on the upper battlements, cavalry reserves in the inner yard for sortie operations. He looked at Serafina one final time. The look held nothing of romance, nothing of regret, nothing of the complex emotional architecture that had defined their relationship. It held something simpler, something that did not require explanation because it predated language. Trust. And send riders north, fast riders, to every village in Ashmere. Tell them the Draymont heir lives. Tell them the Crown is coming to kill him. And tell them that anyone who stands with Blackthorn Keep stands with the future of the kingdom. The riders departed within the hour. The gates were sealed by nightfall. 1,200 soldiers took their positions along walls that had been built by a man who believed architecture should communicate a single message to anyone approaching. Turn back. But the army massing beyond the tree line was not turning back. 3,000 torches flickered in the darkness like a constellation that had fallen to earth and arranged itself into the shape of annihilation. The horns sounded through the night, low, resonant, the brass voice of a kingdom tearing itself apart along fault lines that had been forming for generations. Caedric stood on the highest battlement of Blackthorn Keep and watched the fires multiply. Below him, his soldiers prepared for a siege that mathematics said they could not survive. Behind him, in the inner keep, Serafina held their son against her chest and listened to the horns and ran the calculations that would determine whether Lucian lived to see his first year. The first volley of flaming arrows arced across the night sky at 3 hours past midnight. They struck the outer wall like falling stars, and the timber reinforcements along the western gate caught fire with a sound like the world inhaling before a scream. The battle for Blackthorn Keep had begun, and on the highest tower, silhouetted against the burning sky, the Duke of the Iron Marches drew his sword and understood with the absolute clarity of a man who has finally run out of everything except the truth that the empire he had spent 20 years building was going to be defended or destroyed in the next 12 hours. Not by his army, not by his walls, by the choice he was about to make between the crown he had traded his soul to reach and the child he had never known he needed until the world tried to take him away. The fire spread, the horns grew louder, and Caedric Vexley walked down from the tower toward the gate, where 3,000 enemies waited, carrying in his chest the one weapon that no amount of strategic calculation had ever taught him to wield, the terrifying, annihilating, world-remaking certainty of a man who has finally found something he will not survive losing. The western gate collapsed at the 4th hour. 3,000 pounds of iron-banded oak, reinforced with crossbeams that Caedric's grandfather had installed 40 years ago, under the theory that no force in Valadorn could breach them, surrendered to a battering ram operated by 80 men who did not care about history or engineering or the symbolic weight of what they were destroying. The gate fell inward with a sound that Caedric felt in his teeth, a deep structural groan followed by the splintering shriek of timber separating from stone, followed by the roar of men pouring through the breach like floodwater through a broken dam. Caedric met them at the threshold. He had positioned himself at the gate not because strategy required it. Draven had argued for a defensive withdrawal to the inner courtyard, but because something had shifted in the calculus that governed his decisions. The mathematics of survival had been replaced by a simpler equation. The gate falls, the enemy enters, the child dies. Remove one variable. Hold the gate. Hold it with your body if the walls will not hold it with their stone. The first man through the breach was a Thorncroft soldier wearing chainmail that bore the scratches of 3 previous campaigns. Caedric killed him with a lateral cut that opened him from hip to ribcage before the man's sword had completed its upward arc. The second died on the backstroke. The third managed to land a blow against Caedric's pauldron that dented the black plate and sent a shockwave of pain through the Duke's shoulder. The same shoulder that had carried the weight of an empire for 20 years and was now being asked to carry the weight of a single choice. He did not feel the pain as pain. He felt it as confirmation. The body's testimony that this was real, that the abstract game of power he had been playing for 2 decades had finally achieved the physical dimension it had always been moving toward. Every political maneuver, every military campaign, every marriage and betrayal and calculated sacrifice, all of it had been rehearsal for this moment. The moment when a man discovers whether the identity he has constructed can survive contact with the only thing that matters. "Hold the breach," he shouted to the soldiers pressing in behind him. His voice carried the compression of a man speaking through clenched jaw muscles, blood from a cut above his left eye running down his face and mixing with the sweat that had soaked through his undermail. "Nothing gets past this line, nothing." They held. For 2 hours they held the western gate while the enemy's numerical advantage battered against the bottleneck of the breach, like a river trying to force itself through a crack in a dam. The mathematics were brutal. For every defender who fell, 3 attackers died in the confined space, where superior numbers meant nothing, and the only currency was the willingness to stand in the path of the next blade. Caedric's soldiers fought with the desperate ferocity of men who had been told what they were defending and had made the decision, each one individually, each one in the private court of his own conscience, that the infant sleeping in the inner keep was worth dying for. Not because they loved the Duke. Many of them feared him. Some despised him. But they had seen the child on the battlements at dawn, held in the arms of a woman who had ridden 200 miles to warn the man who had discarded her, and something in that image had bypassed the political loyalties and personal grievances that normally governed a soldier's willingness to fight. They were not defending the Duke's empire. They were defending the possibility that an empire could be worth something more than the ambition that built it. The Eastern assault came 2 hours after dawn. Crown troops, still bearing no insignia, still operating under the fiction of deniability, breached the secondary wall using siege ladders and a coordinated archery barrage that killed 14 defenders in 90 seconds. They poured over the eastern battlement with the trained efficiency of professional soldiers executing a plan that had been rehearsed and refined by men who understood that the difference between a successful siege and a failed one was the willingness to absorb casualties without hesitation. Draven redirected the cavalry reserves. The inner courtyard became an abattoir, horses screaming, steel ringing against steel, the wet sounds of men dying in ways that the songs about warfare never described because the songs were written by people who had never stood close enough to hear them. Caedric fought his way from the western gate to the inner courtyard, in time to see the crown troops forming a wedge aimed at the main keep's entrance. Behind those doors, up 3 flights of stairs, in a room with walls 3 feet thick, Seraphina held Lucienne and listened to the sounds of a kingdom tearing itself apart over the question of whether her son would be allowed to exist. The crown wedge advanced, 20 men deep, shields locked, moving with the mechanical precision of a formation designed to crush resistance through momentum rather than individual combat. Caedric intercepted them with 11 soldiers, all that remained of the garrison reserve, and the collision produced a sound that carried across the entire keep, a metallic thunder that seemed to come from the architecture itself, as though the walls of Blackthorn Keep were absorbing the impact and transmitting it through their foundations. Caedric took a sword thrust through the gap between his breastplate and his left pauldron. The blade entered 3 inches below the collarbone and exited through the back of his shoulder, missing the lung by a margin that could be measured in millimeters. He snapped the blade with his gauntleted hand, drove the broken hilt into the attacker's face, and continued fighting with 4 inches of enemy steel embedded in his shoulder. The pain was extraordinary. Not the sharp, clean pain of a fresh wound, but the deep, grinding agony of metal moving against bone with every swing of his sword arm. His body responded by flooding his bloodstream with enough adrenaline to override the damage signals, and for a period of time that he would later be unable to measure, minutes or hours, the distinction collapsed under the weight of combat. Caedric Vexley fought with the specific intensity of a man who has discovered that the thing he feared most was not death. It was irrelevance. 20 years of empire building had been driven by the terror that without power, without conquest, without the constant expansion of his domain, he would cease to matter. That the boy who had been laughed at, the young lord whose name had been a joke, the duke whose keep was crumbling into the sea would return and consume the monument he had erected over that boy's grave. Every campaign, every political marriage, every act of calculated cruelty had been a brick in the wall he was building between himself and the possibility that he was, at his core, insufficient. And now, bleeding from 6 wounds, fighting in a courtyard full of dying men to protect a child he had not known existed 4 days ago, he understood with a clarity that pain had stripped of all pretension that the wall had been built in the wrong direction. He had spent 20 years fortifying himself against the outside world, while the insufficiency he feared had been living inside the fortress all along. Not as a weakness to be defended against, but as a wound to be acknowledged. The wound of a man who had been so afraid of being small that he had made himself monstrous, and in the process had destroyed the one relationship that had ever made his size irrelevant. Seraphina had not loved the Duke. She had loved the man the Duke was built to bury. The crown wedge broke. It broke not because Caedric's 11 soldiers outfought 20 professional troops, but because a horn sounded from the northern road, a sound that did not belong to any formation currently engaged in the battle, a sound that every soldier on the field recognized instinctively as the announcement of a variable that had not been accounted for in any commander's plan. The riders from Ashmere had arrived, but they had not arrived alone. They came down the northern road in a column that stretched back beyond the tree line. Not soldiers, not a professional army, but something that the noble houses and crown strategists had never thought to factor into their calculations. Farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, women carrying axes and men carrying boat hooks, and entire families who had loaded their lives onto carts and walked south because a rider had come to their village and told them that a child existed who represented something they had stopped believing was possible. A future that was not controlled by the people who had been controlling everything for as long as anyone could remember. They numbered in the thousands, not trained, not equipped, not organized by any military standard that Draven would have recognized. But they came with the momentum of a population that had been compressed under the weight of noble politics for generations, and had finally found a pressure point. The crown troops saw them and hesitated. Professional soldiers were trained to fight professional soldiers, to assess enemy formations, calculate force ratios, exploit tactical weaknesses. They were not trained for this. This was not an army. This was a migration. A movement of human mass that operated outside the framework of military engagement because its participants did not think of themselves as combatants. They thought of themselves as witnesses. They had come to see the air, and the act of seeing was itself a weapon that no sword could counter. The Thorncroft and Ashford forces broke first. Noble houses fought for advantage, and advantage was a calculation that required controllable variables. The arrival of several thousand common people transformed the battle from a military engagement into a political catastrophe. Every soldier who struck down a farmer became evidence of noble tyranny. Every peasant who fell became a martyr whose death would be remembered in villages across the kingdom for generations. The mathematics of the battle had inverted. Killing the defenders was no longer winning. Killing the defenders was losing in a way that could never be recovered. The crown commander, a man whose name would never appear in any official record because his presence was never officially acknowledged, assessed the situation for 60 seconds, then ordered withdrawal. His troops retreated through the same breach they had created, reformed beyond the outer wall, and began the march south. They left behind their dead. They left behind the fiction that the crown had not been involved, and they left behind a battlefield soaked in blood that had been spilled over the question of whether a 3-month-old child had the right to live. The silence that followed the withdrawal was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, the stunned, ringing quiet that descends on a place where extreme violence has occurred and the air itself needs time to recover. Caedric dropped to his knees in the center of the courtyard. Not from choice. His body simply reached the limit of what adrenaline could sustain and began shutting down the systems it had been running on emergency power. His sword fell from fingers that had locked around the grip so tightly that the leather had imprinted itself into his palm. The broken blade in his shoulder shifted as he collapsed, and the pain that arrived was so complete, so totalizing, that it briefly replaced every other sensation in his body. Sight, sound, the feeling of stone beneath his knees, the awareness of the hundreds of people filling the courtyard around him. Seraphina reached him first. She came through the main keep's entrance carrying Lucian in one arm and a field surgery kit in the other, because she had understood before the battle was over that the most dangerous moment for Caedric would not be the fighting itself, but the aftermath, the moment when the purpose that had been sustaining him evaporated and left behind only the body and its accumulated damage. She knelt beside him in the courtyard of the keep she had once managed as Duchess, wearing the same blood-stained travel cloak she had arrived in, and assessed his wounds with the clinical efficiency of a woman who had spent 12 years learning battlefield medicine because the man she married insisted on leading every charge personally. "The blade in your shoulder needs to come out before the muscle tissue seals around it," she said. "Do it." She braced one hand against his chest and pulled the broken blade free with a single motion. Caedric made a sound that was not a scream. His body was beyond screaming, but a low, involuntary exhalation that carried in it the compressed weight of everything he had endured in the past 12 hours. Blood followed the blade in a pulse that Seraphina controlled with pressure and packing, her hand steady, her breathing even, her focus absolute. Lucian, cradled in her other arm, watched his father's face with the unblinking attention that had already become his defining characteristic. "You held the gate," Seraphina said. "Parts of it. You held the gate with 11 men against a crown assault wedge. 12. Draven sent one more before the eastern wall broke." She tied off the dressing and sat back on her heels. Around them, the courtyard was filling with people, soldiers laying down weapons, villagers from the northern column entering through the shattered gate, household staff emerging from the inner keep with water and bandages, and the tentative expressions of people who were not yet certain the danger had passed. "You could have retreated to the inner keep," she said, "sealed the doors, waited for the northern column. The keep would have held. The gate would not have held. The gate was wood and iron. It was not worth your life." Caedric looked at her. The expression on his face had been stripped of every layer of performance, every mechanism of control, every piece of the architecture he had spent 20 years constructing. What remained was the face of a man who had been broken down to his foundation, and discovered, to his own considerable surprise, that the foundation was not power, it was not ambition. It was not the relentless drive to expand and conquer and dominate that had defined his identity since he first understood that the world would crush him if he did not crush it first. The foundation was the capacity to stand between danger and the thing he loved and accept the cost without calculation. "It was worth his life," Caedric said, looking at Lucian. Seraphina said nothing. There was nothing to say. The statement was not an argument or a declaration or a strategic position. It was a confession. The most dangerous man in Valadorn, kneeling in his own blood on the stones of the keep he had built to be impregnable, confessing to the woman he had discarded that the child they had created together was worth more than the empire he had created in her absence. The confession did not undo the damage. It did not erase 12 years of partnership dissolved in 4 words. It did not heal the wound of public humiliation, of being traded for political advantage, of walking out of Blackthorn Keep with nothing but dignity, while the man who had vowed to stand beside her replaced her before the court had finished whispering. But it was true, and in a kingdom built on lies, lies of loyalty, lies of power, lies of the noble houses and the crown, and every institution that had participated in the fiction that ruling was the same as governing, truth had become the rarest and most valuable thing anyone could offer. The days that followed the battle moved with the slow, grinding deliberation of a mechanism rebuilding itself from damaged parts. Isolde Ravenshire was confined to her chambers within hours of the siege's end. The evidence against her family's financial parasitism was presented to a tribunal of 12 lords, half of whom had fought on opposing sides of the battle, and all of whom recognized that the political landscape had shifted so fundamentally that their previous allegiances were now liabilities. The Ravenshire estates were seized. Marin Ravenshire, captured attempting to flee south with documents that detailed the full scope of his family's infiltration of Blackthorn Keep's military infrastructure, was sentenced to permanent exile. Isolde herself stood before the tribunal with the composure of a woman who had understood, long before the verdict was announced, that the game she had been playing had ended in a way that no amount of strategic recalibration could recover. She looked at Caedric once during the proceedings, a look that contained no plea, no defiance, no attempt at the kind of manipulation that had defined their relationship from its inception. It contained the acknowledgement of a fellow practitioner. She had played the game of power with skill and commitment, and she had lost to a variable she had never thought to account for: the possibility that the instrument she had married contained, somewhere beneath the machinery, a human being. She was escorted from the keep without ceremony. Fenwick's trial was shorter and more difficult. The old man sat in chains in the same war council chamber where he had served for 30 years, and he answered every question with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this moment. Yes, he had served the crown as an embedded agent. Yes, he had manipulated Caedric's decisions to serve royal interests. Yes, he had commissioned the assassination attempt on Lucian. No, he did not regret it. "You are a remarkable man, Caedric," Fenwick said, and the use of the first name carried in it the echo of every private conversation they had ever shared, every confidence exchanged, every strategy debated, every moment of genuine counsel that had also, simultaneously, been an act of manipulation. "You built something extraordinary from nothing, and you did it with a ferocity that the crown spent 30 years trying to contain. I admire you for it. I have always admired you for it. And I maintain my position not because I despised what you were building, but because I understood, better than you ever did, what it would cost if you succeeded. You tried to murder my son. I tried to prevent a civil war. The civil war happened anyway. The difference between us is that I was willing to sacrifice one child to prevent the deaths of thousands, and you were willing to sacrifice thousands to protect one child. History will determine which of us was right." Caedric studied the man who had been his counselor, his confidant, the closest thing to a father he had possessed since his own father's death. He studied him with the attention of someone looking at a painting that had hung on his wall for decades, and only now, in different light, revealed itself to be something other than what he had always believed. "History does not determine what is right," Caedric said. "It determines what survives. And you will not." Fenwick was sentenced to life imprisonment in the tower cells. He would die there 4 years later, quietly, without drama. Surrounded by the stone walls of the keep, he had spent 30 years serving and subverting in equal measure. The guards who found him reported that his face in death carried an expression of something that might have been relief. The final relaxation of a man who had been performing a role so demanding that only death could release him from it. On the 9th day after the battle, Caedric convened the first formal assembly of the reconstituted court. The great hall of Blackthorn Keep, still bearing the scars of the siege, still smelling of smoke and the iron tang of blood that had seeped into the stone, filled with representatives from every major house in the kingdom. Many had fought against him. Some had switched allegiances during the battle. All had come because the political reality that emerged from the siege of Blackthorn Keep was undeniable. The Royal Heir existed. The bloodline was verified. And the Duke, who controlled the most powerful military force in the kingdom, had demonstrated in front of several thousand witnesses that he would die to protect that heir. Caedric stood before the assembly in armor that had been cleaned but not repaired, the dents and cuts still visible, a deliberate choice that communicated more than any words he could have spoken. He was not performing strength. He was displaying cost. "I built this keep to demonstrate power," he said. His voice carried the raw quality of a throat that had spent 12 hours shouting commands over the sound of combat. Every wall, every tower, every banner was designed to communicate a single message: that I was to be feared, that my reach exceeded anyone's ability to resist, that the empire I constructed through force and strategy and the systematic elimination of anyone who opposed me was permanent. He paused. The hall was silent in the way that only a room full of people holding their breath can be silent. I was wrong. 2 words. They landed in the great hall of Blackthorn Keep with the weight of a man dismantling his own monument. Lords who had feared Caedric Vexley for 20 years stared at him. Commanders who had fought under his banner in 14 campaigns did not know where to look. Seraphina, standing at the edge of the hall with Lucian in her arms, watched her former husband with an expression that no one in the room could read because it belonged to a vocabulary that only 2 people in the kingdom shared. This empire survives today, not because of what I built, but because of what I nearly destroyed. The woman I discarded protected the heir I did not know existed. The common people I never thought to consider marched 200 miles to defend a child whose name they did not know. The keep I designed to be impregnable was breached by the same noble houses I spent my life trying to dominate. He drew a breath that visibly hurt, the shoulder wound pulling against stitches that Seraphina had placed 9 days ago. I stand before you carrying wounds that will scar. I have earned every one of them, not on this battlefield, in the years before it, in every decision that prioritized dominion over the people I was supposed to protect. He turned to Seraphina. The turn was deliberate, public, designed to be witnessed by every lord and lady and common citizen who had gathered in the hall. The conqueror faced the woman he had conquered and betrayed, and what he did next was the single most difficult act of his life. He knelt. Not the political genuflection of a lord acknowledging a peer, not the ceremonial kneel of a duke before the crown. He knelt the way a man kneels when the only thing left to offer is the acknowledgement that he has nothing left to offer. "I failed you," he said. "I failed our son. I traded what mattered for what impressed, and the cost of that trade nearly destroyed everything." Seraphina looked down at him. The Duke of the Iron Marches, the man who had made kneeling an act he imposed on others, on his knees before the woman he had publicly divorced in this same hall. The symmetry was not poetic, it was surgical. The same stage, the same audience, the opposite performance. "Get up," she said. He looked at her. "You have knelt long enough. Not here, in your life. You have spent 20 years on your knees before an idea of yourself that was never real. Stand up, Caedric. There's work to do." He stood. It was not reconciliation. Seraphina would never return to the marriage that Caedric had destroyed. That architecture was beyond reconstruction, and she was too wise and too damaged to attempt it. What she offered was something that required more courage than forgiveness and more strength than revenge. She offered clarity, the willingness to see the man as he actually was, flawed, broken, capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary sacrifice in equal measure, and to work beside him not as a wife, but as the mother of a child whose future demanded that both his parents operate at the highest level of their capability. She offered truth, and truth in the aftermath of 30 years of lies was the only foundation strong enough to build on. Caedric formally acknowledged Lucian as his legitimate heir before the assembled court. The genealogical chart confirming the Draymont bloodline was entered into the royal record. The implications rippled through the kingdom like tremors from an earthquake whose epicenter was a 3-month-old boy who slept through the entire ceremony with his fist curled around his mother's finger. The crown sent envoys within a fortnight, not soldiers, diplomats. The unmarked troops and the deniable assassination attempts had failed, and the political cost of continuing to oppose a verified Draymont heir who was being protected by the most powerful duke in the kingdom and supported by a popular movement of thousands of common citizens was a calculation that even the most entrenched dynasty could not afford. Negotiations took 3 months. Serafina led them. She sat across from crown representatives in the same war council chamber where Fenwick had confessed his betrayal, and she negotiated the future of the kingdom with the same precision she had once applied to managing Blackthorn Keep's household accounts. Meticulous, relentless, operating from a position of strength that was not military but moral. The crown could not deny the bloodline. It could not eliminate the heir. And it could not ignore the political reality that the most legitimate claim to the succession was now protected by a coalition that included military power, noble support, and popular will. Lucien was recognized as the legitimate royal heir. The formal succession would take effect when the current king died or abdicated. Until that time, Serafina was appointed protector of the realm, a title that carried the authority to govern on behalf of the heir and the responsibility to ensure that the transition, when it came, did not require another civil war. Caedric accepted the arrangement with a grace that surprised everyone who had known him. The man who had spent 20 years trying to seize the throne for himself watched the woman he had discarded, receive the authority he had been chasing, and felt something he had never expected to feel. Relief. The empire did not need another conqueror. It needed a steward. And Serafina Valhart, who had survived betrayal, exile, assassination, and the particular devastation of being abandoned by the person she trusted most, was the only person in the kingdom whose judgment had been forged in fire hot enough to produce the kind of clarity that governance required. On the evening after the formal recognition, Caedric stood on the highest tower of Blackthorn Keep, the same tower where he had watched the enemy fires multiply on the night of the siege, and looked out over the iron marches. The land stretched to the horizon in every direction, scarred by the passage of armies, marked by the evidence of the battle that had been fought over the question of whether his son would live. Serafina found him there. She stood beside him in the wind. Lucien slept against her chest. The silence between them was not the loaded silence of their marriage, the silence of things unsaid and strategies withheld. It was the silence of two people who had been through enough together to understand that some truths do not require language. "You will stay," she said. It was not a question. "This is my keep." "It is your son's keep now." He looked at her. The geological event that had been Caedric Vexley's face for 20 years had changed, not softened. Softness was not in his composition. But the permanent shadow that had lived beneath his brow, the deliberate architecture of intimidation that he had maintained like a fortification, it had shifted. The walls were still there, but for the first time there were windows in them. "I will stay," he said. "Not as Duke, as whatever the man behind the Duke turns out to be. I am not certain I will recognize him." "You will learn." "Learning requires patience. You always said patience was my weakness." "I said patience was your gift. Your weakness was believing you did not need it." He looked down at Lucien. The boy slept with the absolute commitment of an infant who had not yet learned that the world contained things worth staying awake to fear. His face in sleep carried the compressed potential of both his parents, Caedric's jaw, Serafina's coloring, and something that belonged to neither of them, something new, something the kingdom had not seen before and would spend years learning to understand. "He will be a better man than I was," Caedric said. "He will be a different man. Better is a judgment that the future makes about the past, and neither of us gets to make it for him." The wind shifted. It came from the north now, from Ashmere, from the coastal cliffs, from the fishing village where Serafina had given birth in a cottage with a door that assassins had broken down. It carried the smell of salt and distance, and the particular quality of cold that comes from open water meeting open sky. Below them, Blackthorn Keep was being repaired. Stonemasons worked on the breached western wall. Carpenters rebuilt the shattered gate. The fortress that had been built to communicate power was being rebuilt to serve a different function. Not a monument to conquest, but a home for a child who would one day inherit a kingdom and would need to understand from the stones he grew up walking on and the walls he grew up sleeping behind that strength was not the absence of damage, but the willingness to repair it. Caedric stood on the tower and watched the work and felt the unfamiliar sensation of a man surveying something that was not his achievement but his responsibility. The distinction, which would have been meaningless to him a year ago, now felt like the most important thing he had ever understood. He had spent 20 years building an empire that answered to his will. He would spend whatever years remained building a man who could answer to his son. Serafina turned and walked toward the stairs. At the doorway, she paused. Caedric. Yes. The gate you held, the one you refused to abandon. What about it? She looked at him over her shoulder. In the fading light, her face carried the accumulated weight of everything they had been to each other, partners and strangers, allies and casualties, the two most dangerous people in the kingdom standing on opposite sides of a divide that had been created by one man's inability to recognize what he already possessed. That was the man I married, she said. The rest was construction. She descended the stairs. Lucien stirred against her chest, opened his dark eyes, and looked up at the stone ceiling of the stairwell as though memorizing its architecture for future reference. On the tower above, Caedric Vexley stood alone in the wind and felt something moving through the interior landscape of his mind. Not the grinding machinery of strategy, not the relentless calculus of power, but something quieter and more durable. Something that had survived the siege and the betrayal and the 20 years of self-inflicted fortification that had nearly cost him everything. He did not have a name for it yet. He would learn. The empire survived. The heir lived. The wounds scarred over with the particular toughness of tissue that has been broken and repaired and broken and repaired until it becomes stronger than the original. And the woman who had been discarded by a duke became the most powerful figure in the kingdom. Not through conquest, not through manipulation, not through any of the mechanisms that had defined power in Valadorn for generations. Through the simple, devastating, world-altering act of refusing to become what the world had done to her. Blackthorn Keep stood against the cliffs, its black towers rising into a sky that was for the first time in anyone's memory clearing.